Dream Vision 7 Radio Network welcomes Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes, heard every Monday at 11 a.m. and 11 p.m. Eastern Time. Using nearly 200 years of abundant and consistent afterlife evidence, quantum physics, consciousness research, and ancient writings, we seek to understand who and what we are, how reality works, the nature of God, and the meaning and purpose of our lives. Join Roberta weekly to better understand our one reality and gain insights into how we can make the most of the glorious eternal beings that we are.
Welcome to Seek Reality with Roberta Grimes. Joyous conversations about what the afterlife evidence and modern science combine to tell us is true about our one reality. You have nothing to fear. You are eternal and you are perfectly loved. Knowing the truth changes everything. Now, here's Roberta.
Welcome to Seek Reality. I'm Roberta Grimes, and I'm delighted you can be with us today. As we've said before on Seek Reality, the last few decades of the 19th century and the first few of the 20th were a glorious heyday of communication between the living and the dead. Nothing remotely like it ever happened before that time, and nothing more remotely like it has happened since. We realize now just how unique that time was. And long before TV and even radio, many people had the leisure at night, when it was dark, maybe they didn't even have electricity, to develop their mediumistic gifts to an extraordinary degree. And there were very advanced beings who were not in bodies at the time who were helping them to perfect their gifts and to provide extraordinary evidence of human survival through physical mediums of various kinds. We'll be talking about the different kinds today. These communications could be so much more accurate. Rather than there's the mind reading, that your medium today will do with your dead loved ones, it's kind of hit or miss. But back then, it was very accurate. Some of these physical mediums were able to assist our loved ones in speaking through them exactly what they wanted to say, and often even in the loved one's voice, believe it or not. My earliest research, which was back late 70s and for a number of years thereafter, consisted in searching out and reading some of the old books where the earnest researchers of the day had patiently preserved these early 20th century communications. It was really an extraordinary experience to do all that reading. It became an addiction for me till I ran out of finding them. Fortunately, our guest today has found a lot of books I never was able to find. I didn't even know existed. Most of the best communications were received in southern England and in the eastern United States, and by now I've read hundreds of accounts that were received from the dead through deep trance mediums mainly, and doing that sealed the deal for me. As I say in The Fun of Dying, it was like reading hundreds of accounts from people who had all been to Fiji over 100 plus years. They all had very different experiences, but in all cases, the clothing, the customs, the vegetation, the pastimes, the physics of the place, all exactly the same. I never found an outlier. And that is unbelievable. Frankly, it's impossible statistically for that not to have been real. Frankly, that's what sealed the deal for me. Very early in my research, I knew without a doubt that we do survive. And that's ruined my life, ruled my life ever since. And probably my kids would say ruined it, but it ruled my life ever since. I've been very, very anxious to help you understand what I know to be true, which is that all the dead do survive. And I never really got beyond scratching the surface of this wonderful information. So fortunately, there are some people who are making a career out of doing this research. And one of them is the wonderful N. Riley Heagerty, who's now concentrating on making a lot of these priceless communications more broadly available to you and me. Riley is with us for the third time. He's becoming our expert on this. I'm so glad you're here, Riley. Welcome.
Hi, it's great to be back again. Roberta, always a pleasure.
Well, you keep turning out these books, so we have to open them and find out what's in them. And I think this is a great thing you're doing, because most people don't have the patience. And frankly, as I say, no matter how I looked, all the things you found, I really didn't find. So I'm delighted. Now, what made you get into this? Why did you become so excited about doing this work?
I was a professional musician in the early 80s and into the 90s, early 90s, but mostly the 70s, 80s professional musician, and I intended to stay as such. I was signed to an agency in Philadelphia, and I was with that agency for more than 20 years as a professional musician. And at the peak of that career, my fiancée, my live-in girlfriend, Diane Rousseau was her name, was struck down by leukemia.
Oh.
It was a 6-month drama in Johns Hopkins Hospital. Oncology 3 South, I'll never forget it. And about 2 weeks prior to her passing, she called me to the side of the bed and just said, Bradley's here. That was the name of her son, who I never met, who had died 15 years previous from asthma when he was 2 years old. Mm. She just comes right out and says, Bradley's here. So I instinctively looked around. But then I realized, wait a minute. Like
yes.
3 months before Diane was in the hospital, we were at the cemetery standing at his grave.
Yes.
So it was, whoa. She said, well, Bradley's been coming every night because I'm not going to make it through this experience. And I'll be done with this awful leukemia. But I said, you're saying goodbye then? And she said, not really, but you'll understand later. So she passed away a couple weeks later. And so that is what sort of started me. Her clairvoyance about her son were so spot on. That's what got my attention. Because she said, you're not going to question that I'm seeing my son, are you?
Oh,
and
yeah.
I couldn't. How could I question that? So I started just researching, reading everything I could on life after death and mediums. And here I sit 30 years later. 5 published books, and a 6th book you might be interested in knowing is in the works right now.
Great. Great.
But 30 years, so it's a long time. But I've taken it upon myself to really go deep before coming to any conclusions. I said, you have to go deep. You got to dig deep and swim deep to find the pearls. So
I have to ask you something. Did you hear from her? Because everybody is on the edge of their chairs wanting to know whether you did, in fact, hear from her after her death.
I was in England 10 years after that. And the physical medium, the late Colin Fry, was in the cabinet. It was a conference at Burton-on-Trent, this beautiful resort. And there we were, all sitting in the dark. It was about 35 of us. And I could hear in the darkness the shuffling of, it sounded like a gown, some kind of shuffling. And the shuffling came closer and closer and closer to me. And then this emotional, trembling female voice, almost too emotional to speak, gave her name and said the very nickname that I knew her by, which was Di-Di. Her name was Diane.
Oh, my. Oh,
and
wow.
She said, I can hardly speak, but she said, you have my shoes hanging on the wall. You have not been playing guitar, and you went to the cemetery to my grave. She said, you've got to get yourself together. Then she broke down and couldn't speak anymore. Everybody in the room was crying.
Oh, yeah.
It's hard to hold it together. I can usually keep it together, but when everyone starts crying, or if I see anybody crying, it gets me going. I kept it together. But then the spirit guide came through and basically thundered into the room in a nice way. But he said, here's a chance to give every one of you a lesson in sitting. This is how the conditions can break down. If everyone gets too emotional,
yeah,
then the spirit's going to become upset. And then everyone's going to become upset. And then the conditions break down.
So you ruined the seance for everybody else by making them all cry.
Well, actually, she was trembling with emotion first, which really was so dramatic. And I pretty much recognized her voice, and I could almost feel her breath on my face. And she said, I have Bradley with me, and nobody there knew that. And Colin Fry was cable tied to his chair. He was 15 feet away. There was no question whatsoever.
Right.
Now, I could dig deeper into this and say, I needed more empirical evidence to know that it was Diane. But, you just get a feeling.
Oh, yeah, I think they nailed it. I think there wasn't much doubt. I mean...
Well, she came back again after everybody collected themselves. And she said, I don't want you to worry, she said, because it's too wondrous to even explain. You would never be able to explain, to understand what I could tell you about where I am. She goes, but I will see you again. And she said, you have to keep it together, enjoy your life, and please don't be sad. And I thought to myself, well, that's easy to say. But I learned from that.
That's the universal message they always give us. Keep it together, enjoy your life, don't be sad. So that was...
Live your life the way I would have wanted you to.
Yes.
Don't live your life in sorrow. That's not what I want, she said. She said everything's fine because it's just too impossible to explain, but you'll understand in time. So here I am, 30 years later, talking to you, and 5 books later, the subject is so enthralling. I've never stopped doing the research, and I probably never will.
Yeah, it's really addictive. I have to, I assure you all listening, you get to the point where you just can't stop doing the research because you keep learning these wonderful new things. It's the most perfect treasure hunt you can imagine, and the treasure is your own eternal life.
I consider it a compliment to the listeners. I hope that they're complimented by the fact that I've spent 3 decades. I mean, it's not like I don't know what I'm talking about. So,
but you did it for them. You did it for them, didn't you? It's fun for you, but it really, you get to the point where you want everybody to know what you've learned, and so that's what I learned.
If they knew the depth of the subject, then, in my mind and in my opinion, there is nothing that is more important in this life than this subject. Not anything in history, no wars, no political. There is nothing that can compare to the empirical, solid evidence of positive proof of life after death.
Yes.
And the power of cause and effect. There is nothing more important that a human being could know.
Yes, I agree with you.
Tell me what's more important than that.
Yes. Well, the thing is, it does transform your life. When you truly get that you never are going to die, nothing in your life is the same. Everything becomes a lot more wonderful. You never are afraid of anything ever again. But also, you start living your life with the purpose for which you came into your life, which to me is very important. Nowadays, we're used to thinking of mediums as mind reading, but we've got the cabinet. The fellow is in the cabinet. He's in a deep trance. He's tied to a chair, and suddenly there's ectoplasm in the room and people walking around and noises. What are your thoughts on physical mediumship?
The great past of spiritualism, physical mediums, they usually were developed at childhood. A lot of the mediums in my books did not need development circles and groups, and they had their gifts right from childhood. Don't ask me how that's possible. I do not know. But it's just a lot of them never needed development as such. But in the presence of a physical medium, the phenomena and the manifestations happen apart from the medium, which means it has nothing to do with the medium talking or... The mediums are usually in trance and somehow tied or pinioned to their chair. I don't necessarily agree with that stuff, but because I think the mediums, the manifestations and the evidence will prove itself.
Yeah, well, I hope you're right about that. But it is typical that they be tied down, both for their own protection because they're in trance and they could, start sleepwalking, but also because if they're tied down, if it's impossible for them to be walking around the room and there's no other way anybody could get in and walk around the room, then whatever's walking around the room must be spirit. Why is it that we have to be in the dark most of the time or in red light?
Because the light is energy, and energy, light can break down energy. Everything that's ever been born has been born in darkness. It doesn't matter what it is. Every form of life starts in darkness, and mediumship and manifestations and ectoplasm and the psychic energy is no exception. The spirits say that it's beyond your understanding, but light breaks down energy, and we need the energy in the dark. Just like a photographic plate.
Yeah,
just like birth, the baby's born in the ruby red in the darkness of the womb. All plants begin underground in the darkness, germinate in darkness. It's the same thing. Life usually begins in darkness. So it's a great mystery. No one really knows. And the spirits, they can't find a vernacular that our feeble minds can possibly grasp to really explain this stuff. But from what I can see, the psychic force comes from the physical medium, and the spirit chemists work